most challenging thing about making Priest was putting the world together. Because the world does not exist.
It's really in a sort of alternate reality.
You don't know what year it is, what age it is. It's rough and dirty, but there's hope. It's really like dreamland.
Priest was an opportunity to design a whole world and work with an alternate history of the world and try to make it strange and textured and interesting. And part of it for me was, what could I say about vampires?
One of the things that really excited me about writing the script was I had sort of a frustration with the vampire mythology and lore at this point. I was tired of seeing the same old vampire over and over again. Very sexy, very cool, but not very scary.
There are so many vampire projects now that are the traditional kind of gothic or romantic vampires, versions of the same thing since Dracula. So we wanted to go to a place that kind of returned the vampire to something really scary.
The vampires are definitely more monster-esque, which is so amazing. They're an all-original beast.
They're creatures, they're animals, they're insects, they're all of that kind of put together.
We wanted to keep them close enough to a human design, so where they're similar, but far enough away to where they could never really be a person inside a suit.
There are certain aspects of them that are quite a bit skinnier than a person can be, and then they move much faster than a person. So the vampires are principally CG, so you can kind of let them do anything you want.
Resetting, guys, resetting!
But what we try to do is we have a stand-in for vampires, and then we will remove the actor and replace him with a CG vampire.
So the only thing that you
want the vamps in shadow instead?
Like, maybe you see a shadowy movement,
yeah,
but
It's less about this phantom acting and more about really getting something that we can integrate into the film.
For the vampire vocalizations, we struggled with it. You know, I'd always demonstrate for people what I wanted it to feel like, you know, and I'd go, you know, and they'd have these kinds of sounds. And so they finally said, well, why don't you just record that? And then the sound designer who was in charge of the vampire voices would take those recordings and would manipulate them and create new kinds of sounds using them. And it was great.
We go to the vampire caves, which is, you know, a completely invented world. So, you know, we created these sets that are sort of based on a kind of bee colony, as it were.
It was not an easy set to work on. It was dangerous to move around on, and it was dark, and you'd constantly smash your head against some rock that's, you know, jutting out. One of the other things that was really challenging is the tunnels below. The section of tunnel isn't long at all, actually. It's really short, but we had mirrors that are angled on the edge of each side of the tunnel. So they look like they go on forever. And people were constantly running into themselves.
Whoa, man!
Or you would try to talk to somebody and it was dark and you realized you were talking to yourself. Because you look down and you go, hey, can you, oh, okay, that's me. Happened all the time. City 5, I really pushed the sort of industrial theocratic fascism that you get in the city. So it's hyper-industrialization. A lot of the visual reference for it came from parts of Hong Kong and East Europe during the Soviet era.
There were looks that we've seen before in the kind of industrial world, but suddenly overlaid with this religious aspect, gave it a completely new dynamic.
But it's not referencing the church in our world. And the church's symbol is the cross in a circle. It's meant to almost be more like a corporate logo. It's sort of this idea of industry and government and religion all fusing together into something that is controlling people's lives.
Move forward. When I walked on, it sort of had a kind of big brother, you know, attitude towards it, or Orwellian feel about it, and I could see that. Also, I think there's a little bit of H.G. Wells in this, things to come.
One of the ideas that we had in the production design was what we called retrofuturism. So kind of the idea was maybe the world had advanced past where we are now, been devastated by war, and had regressed, essentially. So we had some technology from the present or future, but it started to regress. We have gigantic electronic billboards in the city, but they're really old-looking. Computer graphics in the automated confessional booth, where you can see the scan lines really clearly. It was super glitchy, nothing stable. And so just constantly working every idea through that filter of retrofuturism.
The devil comes in many shapes, many shapes, many shapes.
Nightshade Reservation. Nothing but redouts and rejects.
And then for the Nightshade Reservation, we made that almost entirely a real location.
The Fort MacArthur gun battery, where we shot the Nightshade sequence, was a gun battery built after World War I to defend the Los Angeles harbor. It's 30 feet of concrete and has been in disuse for a number of years.
And it was graffitied, covered with graffiti. It looked like a skate park, a really cool one. And we went, maybe we could make this into a thing. Okay, if we build another wall and then we digitally extend it, and we can add these huge stadium lights, and then build kind of like a little shanty town within it. And fortunately, it all came out really well, and we're really pleased with the sequence.
You're not welcome here, priest.
Perfect.
I've always been a big fan of Westerns, particularly spaghetti Westerns, and I love that they've sort of created this almost supernatural-like world, this weird version of the Western. And that was something that I also wanted to take from.
So we've got this city, Jericho, and when they turn up there, it's like a cowboy town, but in some weird parallel world. And we actually built it at a place called Melody Ranch, which is a really well-known, very historical cowboy ranch. But when we first went there, everybody's looking at this place and we're all going, it doesn't really belong in the world of concrete cities.
After much research and after looking around at many, many different places, we decided to take the Western town and bring the industrial elements to it.
Piping and big tubes and vats and machinery and all sorts of details.
So that was a lot of fun, kind of creating this completely unexpected sort of cowboy industrial city.
B-Mark, action!
When we shot Black Hat Siege of Jericho with Carl Urban's character, we did a take with Carl where he was listening to a piece from Mozart's Requiem. We played the actual piece on the set, and miraculously, through the power of good planning by our AD department, he would go through the stuff and the explosions would just happen almost perfectly in time with the music. It was almost just funny. Like, dun 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 dun, boom, dun dun dun, boom, and it worked out great. And Carl wasn't sure about the conducting thing, and then he looked at it and he saw the explosions happening on set, and we all just started laughing. We just thought it was so great. And like, okay, that goes in the movie.
One of the big challenges for us was to try and find deserts that had no vegetation, which sounds crazy, but actually most of deserts are full of vegetation. So, we were looking for dry lake beds that had absolutely nothing on them. It would just be like mud flats. Just to kind of get the feeling that after this vampire wall, everything had been destroyed.
We shot on some amazingly desolate locations that are just so beautiful. I'd never seen landscape like that before.
But there were a couple of days when we had what's called whiteouts, where the sand and wind was so dense that we had to turn the cameras off and we had to take shelter.
There's a lot of dust on this and a lot of grime, and I'm kind of the only girl that really experiences all of that. And it's funny because the boys, the dirtier they get, the better they look.
We're here out in Trona Ridgecrest here on the, I'm gonna pan around here so you can see our environment. Take a look at that. Wow, look at that. This is where we're staging a number of scenes in the movie, and you can see behind me here is the Outpost 10. That's where the Pace family lives and where they're attacked by vampires. In Outpost 10, we built it on the stage at Sony, the interiors, and then we built the exterior here out in the dry lake bed. And we like this location. I like this location a lot because it just is it's got a very post-apocalyptic feel to it. It's really, really, really hot. If you can't tell, it is 122 degrees here today. So pretty tough conditions to work in.
Reset, please, right away. It was really good.
Because we needed a very flat landscape for our train to be running through. We went to a couple of these dry lake beds that were like 6 or 7 miles long.
We came up with the concept of having a big rig pull 3 essentially shipping containers that were redesigned to look like the middle section of the train, because you don't want the train to be 100% CG. You want a combination of digital shots and practical shots.
So we can actually have shots of motorcycles pulling up the train and people jumping on the train and seeing people on top of the train while it's actually moving.
We trained sort of for like 9 months to get me physically fit enough for the job. I really wanted to do as much of the action as I could.
Paul did the stunt where he leapt off the train and grabbed Lucy. I mean, he really did it, and it looks great because it's real. And I was surprised that he wanted to do that.
I'll be honest about it, it was really frightening. And I did think, what on earth am I doing? What am I doing?
Afterwards, he went, I can't believe I just did that. That was crazy. Because you don't feel the wire holding you. He was saying you just run and you leap off the train, and every instinct in your body is saying, don't do this.
It's a new experience for me, flying off trains and swinging around and getting bruised. The more bruised you get, the more authentic.
We had a few bumps and scrapes on the way. This one sequence with Paul's hanging onto the side of the train. I'm supposed to stomp on his hand, which obviously elicits a great deal of pain. Well, we did it on the first take, and I missed his hand completely, but the heel of my toe just on my boot caught his finger, and he just was like, ah, fuck! And I'm thinking, my God, he's such a good actor. And, you know, of course, the set comes to a complete standstill, and you just feel like a complete moron. Everyone thinks, oh, good one, you just broke his hand. Thankfully, that didn't happen, but that's all part of it.
Yeah, no, it'll be great because, you know, remember, the whole world's racing by in the desert and everything.
The train sequence is intense. I mean, you've got to go out with a bang on a movie like this because they're doing such a wonderful job action-wise, story-wise. It's pretty incredible.
Hopefully audiences want to go back to the world of Priest. I hope that they've had a good time, that they've felt like they've been taken to a world that's unique and textured and interesting, but there's a lot of other places to take it. Big aspects of telling the story of Priest was designing the weapons that the priests use, as well as the vehicles that they ride. And we created a label for it. It was called Brutal Functionalism. It's like the anti-Apple store, you know what I mean? It should look heavy and steel, without regard to aesthetics and design. For example, the familiars have rusty blades tied to sticks. Priest Spike has a heads-up display. It's just going to present you the information, and it's going to have information on top of information. We wanted Priest weapons to feel like they were almost made by like German engineering of the World War II period. So they're machined, but we would leave certain aspects of them unfinished. So that was a big part of how we designed the world.
Priest, he has this incredibly beautifully designed knife. It's just really elegantly designed, really beautiful. It's silver and has these 2 blades. At the push of a button, springs open, separates into 2 knives.
What we built here is a prop that, when manipulated properly, it goes from 1 knife to 2. So now he can throw one at somebody and still have a weapon to defend himself with.
So we went for something powerful and sleek. I think also we've come up with pretty cool ways to take traditional religious icons and kind of weaponize them.
And one of the ideas was that the weapons convert. They become the tools of war, so they have kind of a dual purpose, and we carried that design aesthetic through all the weapons that the priests use.
I've held on to it all these years.
Priest has a weapon where he's holding almost an industrial cross. When he looks at it, it's as if he's drawing strength from it.
And what happens is the bottom here comes off, and you have a dagger. And that's a rig that we can load up with blood on the inside, and on puncture, it'll break and leave a blood mark when it comes out.
The throwing crosses, they were actually one of the very first things that we designed. When they transformed, they're actually digital. We made them in two versions, the sort of regular cross and then the throwing cross.
It's one of my favorite sort of moments in the film. I take out a Bible. The vampires are coming. And I start to read, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil."
Your words mean nothing to them, priest.
And the camera comes around behind me and you look at the Bible and you see that there, in actual fact, are no words. And what there are throwing stars.
It becomes one of the signature kind of shots of the movie. So that idea that all the weapons transform was really interesting. Each of the actors had to learn how to use different weapons in the movie, and Maggie Q's priestess character has a rosary that becomes a rope dart weapon.
It's originally a wushu weapon. It looks like a rosary, and then it deploys into a sort of long rope. And then at the end of that, you've got the cross that's sharp as a knife.
It's a throwing, stabbing, twisting, pulling weapon, which is very, very difficult to use. It takes years to become a master of the rope darts. And so Maggie, worked a lot with her stunt double trainer.
The one I was training with had a tennis ball at the end of it, so I wouldn't stab myself in the face. But she sort of wields that and is able to, take guys off their motorcycles, slice people into pieces. So it's really cool.
If there was an aesthetic to the priest's weapons, there was a different aesthetic for the more frontier weapons. I mean, the wasteland props, everything is kind of meant to feel like it's been handcrafted. So Hicks's blade, we finally came up with one where it had a quote from the Bible engraved along its edge and looked like the handle had been made of bone.
The beautiful thing about this knife, if you can get in there and really see it, is we actually made it out of Damascus steel, which is a very ancient steel. This type of blade work goes back to 500 BC. It's all had to be hand sculpted before it was actually made. So there's got to be 100 hours probably into this knife here right now.
And part of the idea that we had was to kind of take an anachronistic approach to these things where we're combining technologies in ways that it looks like it should work, but you're kind of wondering, well, how would that work? So, Owen has a shotgun. It has some kind of pump mechanism. It has, I think, 5 or 6 barrels. It almost looks like an old-time machine gun.
He thought with vampires being as dangerous as they are, that our shotgun would be based on a Gatling gun, which was a gun that was used in the Civil War, which is capable of laying down an extreme amount of fire. We think we got that across with the makeup of it, that it's a very deadly weapon.
It's just so cool, like this, and he points it up. So we thought, well, Hicks has got to have a gun that feels appropriate.
This is Hicks's shotgun, and this is based on a early 19th century lever action shotgun. Although the design of the weapon is based on an old weapon, we've added a lot of modern elements to it to fit into our world. Likewise, this is a modified gun that was based off a Ruger 22 automatic.
We created a gun that was both a revolver and a semi-automatic. So it had both a section for a magazine, but it also had a revolver mechanism in it that would rotate, and it had 2 barrels. So in terms of gun physics, that doesn't make a load of sense, but it was just so freaking cool that we couldn't not do it. And Max made a gun that worked.
You load it just like a real gun. It actually fires blanks. It's very, very loud and very, very impressive when it goes off.
It's like 10 pounds, the real one. And we've had scenes where I have to hold it up for the entire scene, and you can just see, like, towards the end, I'm just it's slowly dropping. So we ended up having to cut the scene in half because literally after like 2 takes, I could not hold it up for the life of me.
It's particularly appropriate for his character because he is really kind of out of his element at the beginning of the movie.
Focus!
Because it's such a large gun, one of the ideas was that he needed to grow into it. He had a bigger gun than he was really ready for at the beginning of the movie, and by the end of the movie, he'd kind of grown into it, which is cool. The same thing with the vehicles. Each bike sort of represented a different kind of aspect of the character's personalities. Hicks's bike, I said, you know, I want the wild one. I want a 50s cool guy bike.
The Hicks bike was a little more grounded in reality, but still very aggressive and very brutal looking, not aerodynamic whatsoever. They were built on Suzuki Gladiator 600s, which is kind of a road bike, but has some dirt aspects to it. It was an assemblage of some custom fiberglass pieces that were molded and custom sheet metal.
There was the idea that Hicks, being a wasteland sheriff and growing up in the wasteland, that he'd be a kid that would have highly modified his bike and tinkered with it.
So it had a swing arm that was lengthened, it had oversized tires that were built, had custom rims that were built completely specifically for the bike. There's always the challenge of maintaining the aesthetics, but being able to build it. Surprisingly, you know, when the bikes were done, we took them out and they rode like a charm.
And that's one of the most bitchin' things we have in the movie, and Cam just looks so freaking cool on it. The biggest challenge was the Priest motorcycles. There was sort of an idea that the Priest bike was like the weapons that are being handed to an elite force. Only priests have these weapons. We wanted these bikes to feel like you were sitting on a jet engine.
I mean, they're the size of an airplane. It's kind of funny, you see me on it, you know, once I straddle it, I mean, I disappear. But it's very cool looking, so that's the point.
One of the biggest challenges in building this bike, they wanted a motorcycle that had to, on a certain level, almost defy the laws of physics. The front tire was 3 feet in front of the normal forks. And the rear tire needed to be 4 feet behind where you would normally find the rear tire of a motorcycle. So we used a conventional drag race motorcycle setup in the rear. We then used drag motorcycle tires that were almost 1.5 feet wide on both the front and the rear, which is completely unheard of and also makes riding the motorcycle a very serious challenge.
I did lots of learning to ride on the motorcycle at Dodger Stadium. It was all manageable in a massive car park in Los Angeles. And then they took them out to the actual desert, and it was a slightly different story. There were a couple of accidents, so at that point, we were absolutely not allowed to ride them without these training wheels, which was really humiliating because I'd spent all this time learning to ride this bike.
I mean, you could ride it in a straight line, but we'd have to turn these very, very wide circles to get the bike to turn around. So we actually shortened the front of the wheelbase again, back a little bit closer so they had more stability and control. And then we digitally extended the bike back out, doing a digital front end for that so the bikes retain their original design. And they did the work so well that you can't tell. I mean, no one knows that the bikes are half CG. It's pretty great.
Nicely done.
Normally they'd take manufacturers of these things for real, take years of testing and developing to make them right. And we had, 12 weeks to engineer a bike, but they really fit in our world. So the motorcycles were really fun. And all the weapons, they're the neatest props I'd ever seen. And hopefully audiences want to go back to the world of Priest and experience it.